አሁን መጀመር ትችላለሽ።
እሺ. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Mahalet Sambeta. I'm a graduate of Purdue University with a master's degree in instructional design and serving as a learning development professional. I am the moderator for this meeting, which is organized by Ethio-American. Ethio-American is an independent international civil society organized for the promotion and defense of civil rights for all Ethiopians. Ethio-American envisions a world where ordinary citizens are empowered to participate fully as agents in the affairs of their community and their country. Please be advised that this meeting is being recorded. We have 5 speakers today, and each speaker has about 20 minutes. I'll give each speaker a time reminder to summarize their presentation. We thank all presenters for honoring their time, the allocated time. I want now to introduce Dr. Ethio-American, who is the chairman of Ethio-American, to be our first speaker. Dr. Ethio is also one of the founding fathers of Ethiopian Community Association of Chicago and served as an executive director for over 30 years. In 2013, Dr. Ethio received a Refugee Rights Chairman Award at Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights Annual Benefit Celebration. In 2016, Dr. Ethio was recognized as an outstanding community leader by the Chicago Cultural Alliance. It is my honor to welcome Dr. Ethio as the first speaker. Dr. Ethio.
Thank you, Mahalet. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, our listeners, wherever you may be. Welcome to this timely and important Ethio-American Relations Conference. I would like to begin by thanking our distinguished speakers who are here to share their profound knowledge and experiences on Ethio-American relations. I would like also to thank the audience for taking the time to come to this conference. As most of you may be aware, more than 120 years of diplomatic relationship between the US and Ethiopia, with all its ebbs and flows, has cemented commendable and tangible economic, cultural, and educational foundations. We believe that sharing the challenges and opportunities of this long-standing relationship with the conference participants by our expert panels would help to clear up misunderstandings and build mutually beneficial relations between the two countries. Ethiopia is a geographically strategic nation and as such has garnered the attention of superpowers, sometimes with positive outcomes, and sometimes for the determinant of Ethiopia's best interest. Many of the current challenges in the Ethiopian-American relationship can be traced back to the revolution in February of 1974. That brought the Derg to power. Those unhealthy relationships have only worsened since Abiy Ahmed came to power, particularly the last 2 years, since the beginning of the war between the PLF and the Ethiopian government. One may ask, what are the US interests in Ethiopia? Why is Ethiopia important to the US? The most important answer is the role that Ethiopia plays geopolitically. It is situated in the Horn of Africa. It is the second most populous nation in Africa, the largest in East Africa. It is primary source of the Nile. It has young population with greater growth potential, along with many other important dynamics such as history, culture, specific to Ethiopia. Geopolitical interest of the US also extends to trying to counteract some of the inroads that other superpowers are making, not only in Ethiopia, but in all of East Africa, in particular, the inroads that China is making. Another often mentioned and official position of the US is human rights protection and democratic governance. However, there are many analysts that feel that these stated goals of the US are a pretext to diminish the strong influence Ethiopia has in Africa and its Pan-African movement. There could also be other hidden reasons that have not yet been revealed. Ethiopia, on the other hand, has strongly expressed in many ways its desire for its territorial integrity, national sovereignty, peaceful coexistence with all nations, economic development, and democratic governance. These goals mirror the stated official position of the United States. Therefore, it would be in the best strategic interest and general comfort benefit for both nations to work together to help strengthen this agenda.
Here we are.
During the war with TPLF, the United States accused the Ethiopian government of genocide, ethnic cleansing, systemic rape, use of starvation, as a weapon, and various war crimes in the conflict in the northern part of Ethiopia. It also imposed and threatened to impose several punitive sanctions. Those misleading charges have gradually been found biased and tilted toward supporting TPLF. Stephen Omamo recently has written a book. He was the country director of World Food Program. In his book titled "At the Center of the World in Ethiopia," has documented that there was no deliberate blockade of food and other resources on the part of the Ethiopian government. Also, Western European countries and the media labeled atrocities committed during the war of genocide by the government without even mentioning the atrocities carried out by the TPLF in Maikadra or other human rights abuses committed by TPLF, including systematic rape carried out in Amhara and Afar regions by their troops. What has been puzzling for many Ethiopians in the diaspora as well as in Ethiopia is what benefit can be gained by the selective condemnation of human rights abuses. Why such coercive and punitive measures are being deployed consistently by the US government? Many people think the strong lobby operation by the TPLF that has reached many people close to power in the United States has played a part in that reason. The conference, therefore, examines the history of the relationship with all its hiccups, difficulties, and challenges. And secondly, it assesses Ethiopia's geopolitical importance in the configuration of relationships in the Horn of Africa. It also discusses considerations US economic investment and development in the region, using examples of South Korea, Taiwan, as possible models to pursue in Ethiopia and Africa. Explore challenges and opportunities Ethio-American relations have and how we can take advantage of a new generation of Ethiopian Americans not only as entrepreneurs, intellectuals, but as a bridge to help solidarity relations. We hope this conference will bring to light the critical problems the two countries are facing and outlines possible solutions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Urku. Our next speaker is Dr. Theodore Vistal. Dr. Vistal has been a member of the faculty at the Oklahoma State University since 1988, serving in the Department of Political Science. In 2012, he received a Lifetime Commitment and Dedication to Democracy and Development in Ethiopia Award from the Global Civic Movement for Change in Ethiopia. Dr. Vistal has served as an associate director of the Peace Corps in Ethiopia. He lives in Tulsa, Oklahoma with his wife, Patricia, who taught in the Creative Arts Center of Haile Selassie First University. They have 3 children, 2 of whom started school in Addis Ababa. I now welcome Dr. Theodore Vista. Dr. Theodore Vista? You are muted, I believe.
There, now am I unmuted now?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
Okay. Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Mr. Urku, Crown Prince Ermias, thank all of you very much for having me on the panel today at the conference. It'll be my pleasure to talk about Ethio-American relations, challenges and opportunities. In my remarks, I'll be talking about the history of Ethiopian-American relations, where we are now, where we hope to be in the future. One of the interesting things in preparing my remarks is that many people taking part in today's conference were part of the history of the great connection, the great relationship between Ethiopia and the United States. This relationship, in terms of diplomacy, goes back to early 1903, when Robert P. Skinner, an emissary of President Theodore Roosevelt, held a cordial 9-day conference with Emperor Menelik in his new capital, Addis Ababa. The American contingent included 24 Marines who traveled partly overland because the Djibouti-Addis Ababa rail line was not yet complete. That was the first connection of the US military with Ethiopia, a connection that was going to continue for many years. That was arguably the most exciting diplomatic gathering the United States has ever been engaged in, sending some 30 Americans to this Horn of Africa country that many people in the United States knew so little about in those days. Trade relations were established with the United States selling cotton and manufactured goods to Ethiopia, which was granted most favorable nation status and profited in turn from the sale of coffee to the United States. The US thereafter played a key role in providing technology to Emperor Menelik and his successor, Emperor Haile Selassie, in modernizing the African country. Highly motivated individuals went about establishing business, diplomatic, and trade missions in Ethiopia up until the time of the Italian invasion in 1935. Let me add parenthetically that there's a tremendous collection of materials about the Skinner expedition at a museum in Ohio. The Massillon Museum has most of the papers from the Robert Skinner expedition, as well as a wonderful collection of photographs. The emperor sent 2 lion cubs to President Roosevelt. Because of the lack of rail connection, one of the lion cubs died in transit, but one made it all the way across a 22-day on-foot camel mule mode of transportation. One of the lion cubs died, but one made it to Washington and became a fixture at what became the National Museum in Washington, D.C. So it's a wonderful story, and there are some excellent photographs. Apparently, Skinner was a native of this town in Ohio, Massillon, and I recommend that museum very highly if you get a chance to see it. Following the return of Ethiopian forces and Emperor Haile Selassie to Ethiopia in 1941, the U.S. included Ethiopia in its Lend-Lease program. In 1944, the U.S. sent the Fellows Mission, a major development connection, to Addis Ababa in that same year. And let me add parenthetically that the granddaughter of the Fellows Mission director is writing a book on that mission. It should be completed in the next year or so. I think it'll be fascinating reading to see what things were like in 1944 in U.S.-Ethiopian relations. President Franklin Roosevelt met personally with Emperor Haile Selassie aboard the USS Quincy in the Great Bitter Lake of Egypt. After the conclusion of World War II, a treaty of amity and economic relations was ratified in 1951. And in 1953, 2 other agreements were signed: a mutual defense assistance agreement, under which the U.S. agreed to furnish military equipment and training, and an accord putting the operations of Kadnu Station, a communications listening post in Asmara, under U.S. command. During an attempted coup to overthrow the monarchy in 1960, the U.S. military played a significant role in helping the emperor's forces. During the 1960s, the Ethiopia-United States Mapping Mission, a U.S. Army project, provided mapping for much of the country. Through fiscal year 1978, the United States provided Ethiopia with $282 million in military assistance and $366 million in economic assistance in agriculture, education, public health, and transportation. The Point 4 program, USAID, and U.S. Information Service educational and cultural exchanges all played significant roles in these accomplishments. I'm proud to say that I was part of some of those programs and was introduced to Ethiopia by working with co-workers. Among my honors at Oklahoma State University, one that I cherished the most was being proclaimed an honorary Point 4 faculty member. Point 4 was generally an older group than my age cohort. Many of them were World War II veterans. And they, from Oklahoma State University, or Oklahoma A&M as it was known in those days, the Royal Agricultural College was started in Alamaya, and an agricultural high school was established in Jima, as well as other operations in Debre Zeit and Addis Ababa and other places in the country. So that was a very significant and successful program. USIA had a program bringing people with experience in state government in the United States to work with the new Ethiopian government after the fall of the Derg. And I was pleased to be a counsel to some of the committees of the new government, that transitional government of Ethiopia that took over after the fall of the Derg. In 1962, the Peace Corps sent its first group of volunteers, the largest in the world at that time. And altogether, almost 3,000 volunteers have served in Ethiopia since the beginning of that program. That, of course, was my main activity in Ethiopia. I served 2 years as associate director of the Peace Corps. And that was a successful program, increasing the number of certified teachers throughout the country. In 1974, a Provisional Administrative Council of Soldiers, known as the Derg of the committee, seized power and installed a government that was socialist in nature and military in style. Lieutenant Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam became head of state and undertook socialist reforms, including nationalization of landlords' property and the church's property. The Derg created a totalitarian style government and built a massive military financed by the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc and assisted by Cuba. In December 1976, an Ethiopian delegation in Moscow signed a military assistance agreement with the Soviet Union. The following year, Ethiopia abrogated its military assistance agreement with the United States and expelled the American military missions. Droughts and a major famine, as well as insurrections, particularly in the northern regions of Tigray and Eritrea, brought the regime under pressure in 1989. The Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, TPLF, merged with other ethnically based opposition movements to form the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, EPRDF. In May 1991, EPRDF forces occupied Addis Ababa, and Mengistu fled the country to asylum in Zimbabwe, where he continues to the present day. Eritrea separated from Ethiopia following the fall of the Derg in 1991, and shortly thereafter became an independent nation. With the backing of the United States, the Transitional Government of Ethiopia, the TGE, was established. The leader of the TGE was Meles Zenawi of the TPLF. In 1994, a new constitution was written that formed a bicameral legislature and a judicial system. A general election in 1995 elected a parliament and chose Meles as prime minister. I was an election observer in that 1995 election, so I was aware of the political ins and outs of holding an election at that time. In Ethiopia's second multi-party election in the year 2000, Meles was re-elected as prime minister. By then, the government was under heavy criticism for its deficits of democracy and abuses of human rights. Allegations of irregularities in the 2005 general election resulted in widespread protest in which the government was accused of massacring civilians. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and with the rise of radical Islamism, Ethiopia again turned to the Western powers for alliance and assistance. After the September 11 attacks in 2001, the Ethiopian Army began to train with U.S. forces based out of the Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa, established in Djibouti, in counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. In my service in the U.S. military, I can vouch for the fact that counterinsurgency was a very significant part of American Army training at that time. Ethiopia allowed the United States to station military advisors at Camp Urso near Diridawa. I met some of those U.S. soldiers stationed there, and other than their one and no football scores, they didn't want to talk about what they were doing in Ethiopia. Meles Zenawi died on 20th of August, 2012. Haile Mariam Desalegn succeeded him as prime minister. Protests broke out across the country, many from the largest ethnic group, the Oromo, in 2016, demanding an end to human rights abuses and the release of political prisoners. Following these protests, Ethiopia declared a state of emergency in October 2016 that lasted until August 2017. On the 16th of February 2018, the government declared a 6-month nationwide state of emergency following the resignation of Prime Minister Haile Mariam, who said he wanted to clear the way for reforms. On April 2nd, 2018, Abiy Ahmed, an Oromo, became prime minister. In September 2018, Prime Minister Abiy and Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki signed a historic peace agreement, ending 16 years of hostility between the two countries. As the result of the agreement, Abiy received the Nobel Prize 2019. Abiy, guided by the concept of Medimur, which roughly translates as strength in diversity, seeks to resist any tendency towards ethnic ultranationalism and instead promotes national unity and national pride. The general elections of 2020, seen as test of the state of democracy in the country, were delayed due to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Excuse me, Dr. Vista, you have 5 minutes to wrap.
Thank you. Relations between the federal government and the Tigray regional government deteriorated after the scheduled time of the election. And on the 4th of November, 2020, Abiy began a military offensive in the Tigray region in response to attacks on army units stationed there. As a result, thousands of refugees fled to neighboring Sudan. Eventually, government forces won a prolonged war in the region in 2022. Meanwhile, the general election took place on June 5th, 2021. Abiy's newly organized Prosperity Party won in a landslide and chose Abiy prime minister for a 5-year term. Ethiopia-US relations have been chilled during the past 3 years, and an overarching question arising in this conference is what went wrong? Correcting the wrong will have a profound impact, a profound effect on the future of the Horn of Africa and the further growth of democracy and prosperity in Ethiopia. Where do we go from here? Only the future will tell, but one hopes that Ethiopia and the United States will continue in a spirit of friendship and cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vista. I will now introduce our next speaker, Dr. Tibor Naji. Ambassador Tibor Nagy, who served as an Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs from 2018 to 2021. He led the U.S. government's effort to deal with Africa's systemic challenges and dramatically increase trade and investment between U.S. and Africa. He was a U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia from 1999 to 2002. Before that, he was the ambassador to Guinea and deputy ambassador to Nigeria, Cameroon, and Togo. Ambassador Nagy arrived in the US as a political refugee from Hungary and received his BA from Texas Tech University and Master of Science in Accounting from George Washington University. Please welcome Ambassador Nagy.
Thank you very much for having me and giving me the opportunity to talk about one of my favorite countries. And I'm delighted I'm able to follow up Ted's very informative remarks, because I want to start out by first of all, I do not speak for the administration. I am retired, so don't think that I'm espousing U.S. policy. I don't have to be diplomatic. I can speak actually the way I see things. I want to first of all talk, especially for your audience, to talk about the factors and the forces that go into America's relations with Ethiopia. The mirror image, of course, would be how Ethiopia, the factors that go into their relations with the United States, but I can only speak about the American side. First of all, is U.S. domestic politics, because in the United States, domestic politics is the most important factor. And the question there depends on, at that time, is the United States inward looking, or is it have a globalist viewpoint? Secondly would be overall U.S. foreign policy. And this, as you know, can be dramatically different from administration to administration. Is our overall foreign policy of the day, is it transactional, as it has been, say, recently with the Trump administration, or is it more strategic, say the way it was with the Reagan administration, and we'll see how it goes with the Biden administration. On the particular policy, is Washington unified or is Washington split? Because it's not just the White House that makes U.S. foreign policy, it's also Congress, it's the NGO community, and it's the diasporas. Recently, U.S. policy on Ethiopia has in fact been very split, and different parts of Washington have seen things very differently. Then what is overall U.S. Africa policy? And I have said over and over again that in all of the time since decolonization, as far as how the United States views the world, Africa has been of the lowest geopolitical importance. Not to say it's not important, but it has been the lowest geopolitical importance. Administrations say no, but all you have to do is look at where are the resources spent? Where are all the embassies? Where are the consulates? How are they staffed? How much is the Africa Bureau's budget as opposed to other bureaus? Imagine any other part of the world, say Europe or Asia, where you have a country of 130 million people like Ethiopia, and there's only one diplomatic post in that country, as opposed to 4 or 5 that would be in a European country with that many people. However, as I said, that is changing very quickly because the United States is recognizing the true importance of Africa, especially in the 21st century. So hopefully that will change. Then the U.S. view of the Horn of Africa. As some of the speakers have outlined, it is an extremely strategic region, but it is also a hugely problematic region. As a matter of fact, recently I gave a lecture on perfect storm in the Horn of Africa. And I think everybody agrees on the importance of Ethiopia to the Horn region. Will Ethiopia, or can Ethiopia be a stabilizer or a destabilizer in the Horn of Africa as probably the most important of those countries? And Dr. Erkku very well outlined the importance of Ethiopia itself, which is obviously the next factor. Its geostrategic value, its role as what we would call an anchor state, its huge population, and also the tremendous potential for trade and investment. And then another factor in our Ethiopia policy are the roles of other outside countries. We mentioned China, very important, Russia, countries in the Gulf, and others around the region. While the Biden administration says that U.S. foreign policy is not based on what other countries do or don't do, reality begs to differ. So where do we stand now, given all of these forces at play? I think we all have to agree that we are coming off a very, very low point, because as Ted said, we went through a very problematic period. And as also Ted outlined, the U.S. history with Ethiopia has been very similar to what I would say is looking at the stock market chart over the last 20 years. There are definitely some high points and some, unfortunately, low points. I would say that the high points in our overall relations were during the times with the emperor. Then again, we hit a high point right after 2001 when I was ambassador, and Ethiopia, I would have to say, was one of the most forthcoming and supportive countries anywhere in the world for our fight against global terrorism. And then again, when Prime Minister Abiy first came to power, everybody was looking at Ethiopia. I remember the term we used in the State Department then was Ethiopia, the hope of Africa, not the Horn of Africa, but the hope of Africa. The low points, again, as Ted mentioned, during the Mengistu years, I would have to say was a low point. That was my first time of serving in Ethiopia. And during the Great Famine, President Reagan was advised by some of the people in the White House to not send any food in response to the famine because of our terrible relations. And God bless President Reagan. He said, people, a starving child knows no politics. So the food came. And then another low point I would say was during the early part of the Biden administration, when the administration came in and the policy they took was seen by very many as definitely an Ethiopia hostile policy. So we are coming off a low point at this stage. However, at the same time, I feel that Washington is finally starting to appreciate Ethiopia more and more. And this is based on the factors that we just mentioned. But there's also a new factor, and I have to credit you folks on this call with that, because more and more the Ethiopian diaspora is flexing its political muscles. I mean, we have seen this throughout the history of the United States of diasporas come, whether they're the Italians or in my case, the Hungarians, they settle in, they get American citizenship, they have kids, the kids do better than the parents did, and they become very politically active. And all of a sudden, the US political system starts paying attention to them because the political activity comes in as votes. And if there's one thing that politicians pay attention to, it is votes. Also, another factor which I very much sense in Washington is that the US is very, very eager and very keen to see Ethiopia succeed for humanitarian reasons, but also for the very practical geopolitical reasons that I have mentioned. So what I see is a potential for much, much more positive relations moving forward from this point. But there's a big if here, a capital I, capital F. Is the peace process going to move forward? Will there be a system of transitional justice to look at everything? As Dr. Erkku mentioned, not just looking at one side, but looking at at everything that has happened in the northern Ethiopian conflict. Is there going to be progress on national reconciliation? Again, that's an open question, and we will see how that goes. Then I think everybody recognizes the tremendous economic partnership potentials between US and Ethiopian companies, but here's the huge difference. President Xi can order Chinese companies to go anywhere in the world and invest. You guys know in our system, we can't do that. So business is interested, but there has to be a welcoming environment. And US businesses tend to shy away from places that are unstable or places that are hostile to business. So there again, there is a great dependence on both sides to push that relationship forward. To me, the bottom line is that Ethiopia could be one of the major success stories of the 21st century, not just in the Horn, not just in Africa, but in the world. And having positive relations with the United States would definitely help Ethiopia achieve that status. So I remain an eternal Ethio-optimist, and I will always hold that position. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Naji. I will now introduce our next speaker, Prince Ermias Sahle Selassie, who is the grandson of Emperor Haile Selassie. Prince Ermias did his undergraduate work in social studies with economic emphasis at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and he did several years of postgraduate work at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. In 1993, Prince Ermias was named as the president of the Ethio Crown Council. He worked extensively in Ethiopia to preserve his country's cultural heritage and restores the Ethiopian crown as a constitutional monarchy. He has campaigned to attract foreign investments to Ethiopia with a particular focus on impact investment. Prince Ermias has twin sons and is married to Princess Saba Kabeda. Please welcome Prince Ermias. Thank you. You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahalet, for that introduction. And I'd like to thank Dr. Yurko for organizing such a timely conference and for the distinguished panelists who are participating with us this morning. It has been a difficult 2 years for Ethiopians, and I think every Ethiopian I've spoken to has been very depressed by events that have taken place in our country. So we're coming out of a very dark, one of the darkest periods in our history. And similarly, I think in terms of relations with the US, one of a major uncertainty and one of its lowest points in its relations. So we have much to look forward to, but we have many challenges, and time also, importantly, to heal from the traumas that we've experienced of recent times. And I think both Ambassador Tibor and Professor Vestal have done a very good job of outlining the historical relationships between the US and Ethiopia. And I wanted to focus a little bit more on the possibilities and the future ahead. I think one of the main challenges has come from the inconsistent policies and policy shifts based on tactical rather than strategic interests throughout Ethiopian history over the past 50 years in its relationship with the United States. This has put Ethiopia through a political cyclone of instability after it lost its senses during the deposition of the monarchy 50 years ago. A lack of vision and consensus regarding what Ethiopian governments should look like among political parties and civil society is also a contributing factor to the challenges at hand today. The lack of proactive, long-term strategic plan by the US in the Horn of Africa is also at the crux of this matter and helps to explain why maintaining and building upon Ethio-American relationships has proven quite difficult. What then should the US adopt as its strategic plan? Ethio-US relations have gone up and down over time and have plummeted in recent years. We should not mistake these downward turns for permanent trends. I believe warm relations will once again return because of the interest we commonly share. Americans and Ethiopians fundamentally have very similar values. We may have had different historical trajectories, but we have suffered our own civil wars, our own conflicts, and in terms of values, we have shared a very distinct sense of patriotism, faith, very importantly, community and family, which had been eroded in Ethiopia over the past 50 years during communist ideology, but I think can't be completely erased. We have fought together and shed blood together in Korea, and that has been a significant bond. And in recent years, we have fought together to combat terrorism. So the values are there, but it's really where do we go ahead from here? That is the real question. I believe that the division within the Ethiopian polity has been a very confusing one, not just for ourselves, but also for US policymakers. Beyond the short-term interests of few divided groups remains our deep conviction in the survival of a united Ethiopia. A new generation of Ethiopians born in the US is on the rise, and this will fundamentally change Ethio-US relations in the future. Ethiopia can learn from other countries who made America their home and participated vigorously in local and national American politics. We can emulate the ways in which they have given back to their own home countries while maintaining their cultures and strengthening their ties between their old and new homes. Ethiopia's solutions will ultimately lie in the heart and minds of its own people. Ethiopians' relations with the US will not only depend on how the US decides to engage with Ethiopia, but on how Ethiopia itself decides to engage with itself. Whether it will pursue a path of self-destruction or change course and reconcile with its own history, true culture, identity will remain to be seen. I want to also express the very resolute role the US has played recently to stop the war in Tigray, in the northern part of Ethiopia, This is welcome news for all those who care deeply about Ethiopia. And we express really a conviction that the US has the best interest of Ethiopia at heart. There are, however, still very challenging situations on the horizon, which I think the US has to look deeply to tackle it with the same resolute dedication it had to silence the guns in the north. I think beyond the internal conflicts in Ethiopia lies also another possibility for further conflict, regionally speaking. The US has done extremely well to engage the African Union. And I think beyond peacekeeping, it has to also be very proactive in peace building and strengthen the institutions that cater to those demands. The US has many levers in its toolkit it can utilize to bring about a greater role for Ethiopia and the region. And in this vein, policymakers and think tanks have to think out of the box, in my view, to also find a solution to the problem of the dam and our relationship with Egypt. This is very, very important because unless we have a sustainable peace, not just at home, but in the region, it'll be very difficult for us to move forward. In that vein, we straddle a very strategic area in global politics and global trade. And in recognition of that fact, we have to think of a security arrangement that secures the region holistically and move from the intransigence where we stand today. I think that's sane, and it's also more cost effective in the long term. Beyond that, Ethiopia has also all the prerequisites in place to develop independently as a great nation. We have been blessed to have the resources, the manpower. We need the political will, however, if we are to move forward and be able to join the world community, and more importantly, to develop our country. There's no reason why Ethiopia cannot be another South Korea in a generation, but it will take political will and determination in order to enact the necessary groundwork to attract the investment necessary. And the US has to think very deeply why Ethiopia is strategically important and to support it economically so that it can really be the best of itself and be a productive member of the world community. In closing, what I'd like to say is that I am cautiously very optimistic about the future ahead. It is a very challenging, both as a society, politically and also as a society, to heal from the wounds we have experienced. But we must have also the political will to move forward. Also, the Ethiopian government, I think, is in a very difficult and challenging position because it has to be able to move philosophies from opposite sides of the pole and bring them back more to the center, where we resolve our differences on a negotiating table and not through through violence. In the final analysis, Ethiopia and the US must always work to empower each other and not devalue the great historical relationship they've been able to enjoy up to this day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Prince Elmas. We appreciate it. I'd like to remind everybody that we have a Q&A panel where I appreciate some of you already posting your questions. They will be addressed during the Q&A after the presentations. So thank you. I will now introduce our next presenter, Mr. Nagash Abdurrahman. Mr. Nagash Abdurrahman is an activist and a commentator on Ethiopian affairs and an award-winning filmmaker and an educational technology innovator. He is the producer of the multi-award-winning film Cuba in Africa and a founder of RI Systems, Inc., a consultancy service specializing in educational technology and innovation. He is a graduate of Columbia University. I now welcome Mr. Nagash Abdurrahman.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction. And I want to thank Ethio-American for inviting me to be on this illustrious panel. It's an honor and a privilege. And my expertise on Ethiopia is not based on years of academic research, although I've done some of that, nor on years of diplomatic service. Rather, it is based on my own lived personal experience. I have lived almost all of my adult life in the United States. And my experience is the torment of watching from a long distance my beloved country of birth go through so many crises, revolution, unrest, 2 great famines, many wars, much needless infighting, authoritarian rule, and foreign meddling. It is a torment of watching one's country of birth becoming a beggar nation. And I'm sure many, many Ethiopians all over the world share this torment. And having said that, I will get into the topic for today and start out with the latest pivot in American policy, which poses both challenges and opportunities, especially for those of us in the diaspora. I'll start with the challenges and come back to the opportunities towards the very end. And by the way, I've written a couple of articles in the last year on this topic of US-Ethiopia relations, and I'll give you my email at the end for anybody interested. But let me begin with the most recent events. The United States is betting, and I emphasize it's a bet, that a peace treaty and power sharing arrangement between the Tigray Liberation Front, TPLF, and Ethiopia's Prosperity Party will keep the peace and maintain its interest in the region. This is a big, big bet. It's a very risky bet, and I will say it's a wrong bet. I'll argue that this carefully spun arrangement engenders long-term instability and conflict. You may ask why. This is so because the arrangement targets Amharas and neighboring Eritrea. I'll get back to this later, but first I want to say, how did we get where we are today? The TPLF came to power in 1991 through an American brokered agreement. You know a lot of this history, but I think how narratives are presented is important. So that's why I go into a little bit of the history. The American brokered agreement was preceded by at least 10 years of covert American assistance to the TPLF, mostly through the Sudan under the cover of humanitarian famine aid. This effort brought to an end the troubled military regime of Mengistu Haile Mariam. The new regime called itself the Ethiopian People's Democratic Front, EPRDF. The EPDRF was to usher in a new period of peace and democracy. Herman Cohn, the American power broker at the London negotiations, famously promised no democracy, no development aid. but there was to be little democracy under the EPDRF. The new language-based tribal arrangement favored the TPLF, which represented less than 6% of the population. It was a system designed to pit various ethnic groups against each other and to nurture grievances instead of acting as citizens of one big country. In essence, the EPRDF system created mini tribal governments whose survival depended on patron-client relationship with the ruling Tigrayan elite. To be sure, there was significant infrastructure development under the TPLF. At the same time, however, Ethiopia became increasingly dependent on foreign handouts to feed its people and to run the bureaucracy. And there was little democracy to speak of. TPLF rulers were determined to squash any opposition and did so successfully. They mercilessly persecuted and exiled the Oromo Liberation Front, which was originally brought into the coalition. Other opposition elements were continuously harassed, imprisoned, and mercilessly killed. And you don't have to take my word for this. Many of you know this. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Committee to Protect Journalists, among others, meticulously documented the egregious human rights violations. Although the State Department too issued scathing annual human rights violations, the US government almost always chose not to act. And in the aftermath of the September 11, 2001 tragedies, US priorities shifted exclusively to fighting terrorism. Former Ethiopian Prime Minister Meles Zenawi fully understood and exploited America's preoccupation with terrorism. In return for signing up for the war on terror and for invading Somalia, Zenawi was given a carte blanche. Among the most egregious example of Zenawi's brutality was the massacre of at least 193 civilians following protests against the stealing of the 2000 elections. The US chose to look the other way as it was working with Zenawi on the 2006 invasion of Somalia. American support gave the Tigrayan regime a cover of international legitimacy and a feeling of impunity. And the TPLF generously helped itself to both urban and rural land, the source of much wealth in Ethiopia. It also siphoned off much of the foreign aid that came in. And to give you an example, according to Global Financial Integrity, up to $30 billion left Ethiopia in the 10-year period between 2005 and 2014. This is equivalent to almost 100% of the foreign aid that came into the country in the same period. And it's 97 to 100% around that. The economic looting and heavy-handed repression eventually created much instability and mass protests, leading to the ouster of the TPLF in 2018. After its ouster, the group decamped to Mekelle, its regional capital, and began plotting its return to power and privilege. This plot eventually led to the TPLF launching surprise attacks on federal troops stationed in several camps in Tigray. As you remember, the Trump administration was in power at the time, and the United States took what may be called a sober and more even-handed approach. We should be grateful to Ambassador Naji, who's here today, for that even-handed approach. For the record, I want to highlight 3 important points Ambassador Naji made at an important press briefing on November 19, 2020. That's 2 weeks after the war started. 1, he said the TPLF indeed attacked the Ethiopian National Defense Force. 2, the TPLF was responsible for the missile attacks on Bahir Dar and Eritrea. 3, he condemned the massacre in Maikadra, which he said was apparently perpetrated by the TPLF. These were very important truths. Unfortunately, however, all the caution and even-handedness went out the door following the US presidential elections. There was a new pivot in US policy, a pivot to tip the balance in favor of Tigrayan insurgents. a pivot to throw the kitchen sink at the federal government of Ethiopia. So on November 25, 2020, barely 2 weeks after the start of the war in the US presidential elections, incoming National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan sounds the alarm on Twitter about federal troops committing war crimes in Tigray. He says he's deeply concerned about the risk of violence against civilians, including potential war crimes. A few weeks later, Anthony Blinken, the new Secretary of State, chimes in with more alarming warnings that peddle the narrative of the Tigrayan insurgents. He accuses the federal government of ethnic cleansing and other war crimes, such as rape. By May of 2021, President Biden joins the chorus. He talks of his deep concern about human rights abuses in Tigray. He calls for the withdrawal of Eritrean and Amhara forces. Mind you, all these charges were being hurled at Ethiopia without any independent third-party verification. The withdrawal of Eritrean and Amhara troops from Tigray, very contentious issues. These two demands clearly interfere with Ethiopia's sovereignty. Regarding Amhara forces, it is an exclusively internal matter over which Ethiopia should not have been pressured. Regarding Eritrea, Ethiopia is an independent country and the sovereign right to ask for assistance from any country it deems necessary. So the Biden administration's strategy was to threaten the Ethiopian government with war crimes and sanctions if it did not do what it was asked to do. By January 2021, Ambassador Jeffrey Feltman, the special envoy for the Horn of Africa, appears to have imposed a forced settlement. Prominent leaders of the TPLF, such as Sibat Nega, were released from prison. In return, the US appears to have promised no regime change in Ethiopia. There was to be no regime change, but the whole arrangement required a deft act of regime castration. The US had gotten, this was by the time of the Pretoria Agreement, the US had gotten 100% of what it demanded by the time the peace agreement in Pretoria was signed on November 2, 2022. The Ethiopian federal government was forced to negotiate with an insurgent group the national parliament had deemed terrorist. And it appears the federal government also entered into a power sharing arrangement with the TPLF. So mind you, all this after an estimated 500,000 to 1 million people died in this war. This is regime castration. It makes the regime lose credibility and undermines its mandate to rule. These acts will have far-reaching consequences. So you may wonder and ask, why did the Ethiopian government accept the Pretoria deal? Some of my explanations include regime survival and guarantees of no regime change, and the financial crisis, liquidity crisis, and this includes financial cost of the war, which was very high. COVID added additional burdens, and also dwindling foreign exchange reserves. So this was also exacerbated by 18 billion in imports and 4 billion in exports, high external debt and debt servicing. The government was in a pinch. Add to that concerted US pressure. This pressure was charged of war crimes, mass rapes, ethnic cleansing, using hunger as a weapon, and imposition of sanctions and threat of more sanctions. And finally, also domestically, perception of advantage over rivals by certain members of the ruling coalition did pave the way for this agreement. There were internal issues that contributed to this. Now, what I want to say about the war itself is wars are inherently messy, and the war in northern Ethiopia is no different. I'm sure many, many mistakes were committed during the war, and the mistakes, any crimes need to be investigated, and those responsible should be held accountable. But there is nothing in the Ethiopian DNA that makes it more bestial than any other people. And now I'll quickly move on to what I call the premeditated policy of the Biden group. The Biden administration's decision to tip the balance towards Tigrayan insurgents started long before the war and Biden's own election. The Tigrayan leaders who were holed up in Mekelle after they were thrown out of power had many friends, strong contacts, and well-paid lobbyists in Washington. And their investment in friends in high places and lobbyists begins to pay off once the Biden team comes to power. The ideological rationale for the Biden-Blinken policy appears to have been circulating among several former officials who were in the Clinton and Obama administrations and who had close relationship with the Tigrayans who ruled Ethiopia for 27 years. In addition to the issue of personal connections, the US appears to have been concerned about China's growing influence in the region. So 4 days, this is an example, 4 days before the war in Tigray started, the United States Institute of Peace issued a very influential report. It was called the Final Report and Recommendations of the Senior Study Group on Peace and Security in the Red Sea Arena. It is a report that took 1.5 years to assemble. One of its important recommendations was the appointment of a special envoy for the Horn of Africa. Ambassador Jeffrey Feltman was a prominent member of this group. Feltman conveniently becomes that special envoy he recommended. And I will say how convenient. You recommend a special envoy and you become that envoy. Feltman and his assistant, Clayton Knopf, later authored a joint article which raises all kinds of alarms and becomes part of US official policy. The interlocking relationships of think tanks, policymakers, lobbyists, and the Tigrayan insurgents involves a great deal of detail, which I cannot go into here, but it set the tone for a policy that was determined to impose a settlement at any cost. And just very quickly, I want to mention about US policy towards Africa. US policy on Ethiopia is a continuation of its policy on Africa. This is a very important subject, but for today, because of time constraints, I'll not go into a lot of detail. I've also covered it in my article. For now, I'll just make a couple of brief points. US policy on Africa stands on 2 pillars. First pillar is what I would call national security interests, or what I call protection of empire. This policy views Africa through the lens of threats and is translated into a mostly militarized solution with the Africa Command, AFRICOM, as the implementer. The second pillar is an unspoken, mostly racialized hierarchy of nations where Africa is at the bottom of all US priorities. A few examples of kind of racial prejudice includes Trump's famous saying, calling African nations shithole countries. Reagan called African leaders monkeys. And Kissinger said South African whites are here to stay. And I would say beyond personal prejudice, there is ample evidence now that the US secretly worked with the South African apartheid regime while publicly paying lip service to opposing apartheid. And a little bit about double standards. And I'll give Ukraine as an example. Look at the treatment, empathy, and money Ukraine is receiving. Over 9-month period, it received close to $40 billion. In the beginning of the war, American and European journalists said, the Ukrainians don't look like refugees. They look like us. So all I can say is the double standard is clear. No country of color gets that kind of empathy. Not Somalia, not Ethiopia, not the Congo, not Yemen. So there is a kind of a racial double standard. So just to summarize, US policy towards Africa can be summed up on 3 points. One is, don't send me your refugees. 2, don't bring your diseases to my shores. And don't breed terrorists. I'm all coming to the end. Back to Ethiopia. The above picture is, the above is a broader picture in the context that I believe Ethiopian Americans need to take into account when thinking of US policy towards Ethiopia. America's push for a rift between Ethiopia and Eritrea will not help the cause of peace in the region. Pushing for regime change in Eritrea will not promote regional peace or help the people of Ethiopia and Eritrea who have been suffering for a long time. And I'm not Eritrean, but I know this will not serve the interests of both people. Nor will the US pressure on Amhara forces and calls for their withdrawal from the so-called Western Tigray promote peace. US posture on so-called Western Tigray suggests that America favors guaranteeing an exit corridor for Tigrayan insurgents. If the US persists with these policies, it would only sow strife and discord and prolong Ethiopia's suffering. And finally, I will say it's not all doom and gloom. There are opportunities as well. As American citizens, we have the opportunity to work to change the current US narrative and policy. First, we need to arm ourselves with the facts. Based on truth and facts, we have the opportunity to make our case to our congressmen, senators, and policymakers at all levels. Changing narratives and policies is a marathon, not a sprint. So we have to think long-term. We need to engage in the long game of educating the American public and the press why current policies will be harmful to Ethiopia and the larger region. We should resist the temptation to put all our eggs in the Democratic Party basket. Instead, we should work with both parties. And I thank you all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nagash Abdulrahman. I appreciate it. We now have Mr. Gabriel Negato, who's going to give us his thoughts and insights based on what has been presented. Mr. Gabriel Negato, who is a senior fellow Atlantic Council African Center and the founding manager director of Invest Afrique, to provide additional information and comment. Mr. Gabriel, I welcome you now.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you, Ms. Mahalet. And let me also join the others in thanking Dr. Irku and the Ethio-American team for the opportunity to share some thoughts. The problem with being a discussant at the end of the panel is everything has been said and you stand the risk of saying what has already been said. So I try to be a bit more innovative and give it a crack. So there's been repeated reference that, well, to begin with, Ethio-American relations in the past has enjoyed bipartisan support. It has not necessarily been the domain of the Democratic or the Republican Party. I could, however, tell you that speaking to many leaders in the continent, they see a much more favorable Africa policy from the Republicans than they do from the Democrats. But that's perhaps a discussion for another side. And this is not to kiss up to Ambassador Tibor, but this is the reality. But it has largely been in the main enjoyed bipartisan support. However, there is concern that there is some type of misunderstanding between Ethiopia and the US, and that's why the relationship has gone sour and so on. But I don't necessarily share that view. I feel what we are witnessing is a failure to reset the policy, the US policy towards Ethiopia that has led to the current debacle. It's a failure to reset, a failure to adjust the relationship to the evolving situation on the ground. The relationship has not been adapting to the dynamism in Ethiopia fast enough, while Ethiopia's leadership and institutions have largely become more assertive and defining their own agenda and owning the narrative. The U.S. foreign policy has remained static throughout this period. So I think that more than anything explains the relationship. For example, for the most part in the US or in the West at large, discussion about Ethiopia still focuses on diseases and disaster, famine, destruction, and so on. And the narrative has not caught up with the reality on the ground. Today, Ethiopia is much more than the sum of its problems. It's a lot more than that. So I think what we need is a more proactive policy, and according to Ambassador Tibor, we seem to have that. But anyway, let me get to one or two of the comments that were made and address those. Dr. Vestal, I think, gave a good historic narrative of what happened, and there is very little to comment on that. These are historical facts. But let me come to the ambassador. I fully agree. U.S. policy has been less strategic and more transactional, particularly during your administration, the Trump administration. But that was the nature of the administration, so it's not to fault it in one way or the other. There is not a unified corporate view of what the Africa policy should look like within either this administration or the previous. Treasury would have one position, State Department would have another, and it would just, and then the U.S. Congress had its own idea. So it was really all over the place, and there was not a unified corporate view of what the policy should be. But having said that, the policy largely was a low priority. Africa policy, Ethiopia policy was a low priority across the region. And when it's not, it has largely been reactive to China, reactive to Russia, and the new partners that are emerging in the region, including the Middle East and India and the BRICS and Turkey. So our policy, as John, the former U.S. ambassador to the UN said, was to react to what China does in the continent. So there was never a proactive position. A point that Ambassador Tibor again raised was that it seemed like Washington is now appreciating Ethiopia more. It seems like it, and I underline the word "seem" because the proof in the pudding is yet to be seen. We are yet to see what happens with AGOA. And we have yet to see how the U.S. reacts vis-a-vis the IMF World Bank board when the request for $4.5 billion in budget support comes up. So I think that will be the proof for the pudding. But on surface, it does indeed seem like there is some rapprochement between the two. Will peace hold, and will transitional peace and so on and so forth? That is, I suspect all of us are holding our breath. There is reasonable ground to believe that the peace will hold or is holding with some minor modifications here and there. But Ambassador, what is critical, or what is an important lesson from this effort was that the nature of peacemaking in Africa has changed, and perhaps changed for good. The notion that you do not need a former colonial power, be it the US, and most recently now France and Burkina Faso and in Mali, is the dawn of a new political transition process where Africans are coming together to make peace on their own and find their own solution to peacemaking rather than waiting for the West to come and save Africa. I think this is a new dispensation. It's a new day in peacemaking, and it will be important to see how the US and others react to this process, because the idea that Burkina Faso had rejected France as a peacemaker in Mali and so on, says that peacemaking is now transitioning from colonial powers to the continent. Lastly, on Ambassador Tibor's point of view, the issue of the emerging alliance in the Horn of Africa. I think the US is still behind the curve in terms of what is happening in the region. I happen to follow the Horn of Africa, the Atlantic Council, very closely. And what we are noting and observing is that the emergence of an organic alliance in the region. Organic alliance that involves Eritrea, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Somalia, and perhaps Sudan is emerging. This alliance is emerging not with the support of the US, but despite opposition by the US. And this is something that the US administration will have to come to terms with. It is time for it to bring Eritrea out of the cold. Yes, as Nagash said, I'm not an Eritrean either, but the reality on the ground is that Eritrea will remain a dominant player in the peacemaking process in the region. And the sooner the US warms up to that idea, I think the better off we will be. So let me leave that point here. Ermias pointed out the last 2 weeks as being the lowest point. I think all have said that. And the way forward, the preference for tactical versus strategic views, and the lack of vision, which tends to make the relationship not sustainable, but one that needs to be built on shared values and shared the divisions within the Ethiopian polity that he raised, I think is critical on what happens going forward. The division amongst the Ethiopian, both the diaspora and back in the country, makes it difficult for an external partner to have clarity of purpose and direction as to where they want to be in that process. Similarly, the need for an Ethiopian introspection, an inward-looking exercise amongst Ethiopians going forward, I think is a critical point, and one we all will need to look at. The issue of the US needing to be active in the peacemaking process again is well taken, but however, as I've pointed out, peacemaking now has a new face, a new address, and the US will have to, the US and the West largely, has to come to terms with that reality that peacemaking is now more organic, more sustainable when it's done locally, but with the support of the Western partners, and not the old, you do what I tell you to do type of peacemaking. Lastly, friend Nagash, I share your sense of torment of being a bystander while the whole world has everything to say about your country. I definitely share that. Your point about the US brokered EPRDF led to the conflict and the lack of democracy and abundance of conflict is well taken. The US government giving coverage, particularly to the Malda Zenawi regime, whether it's through its military adventurism into Somalia and so on, or whether it's through its hitherto unforeseen corruption rates in Ethiopia, is telling of where the US puts its commitment. If there was indeed a partnership around principles and values, the US would have spoken up, would have objected to what the Zenawi government was doing at the time. including the massive siphoning of resources. But the US chose to look the other way and instead proclaimed democracy was thriving in Ethiopia. The pivot in favor of the TPLF was clear. Efforts to one of the lessons, I think, of the recent conflict, Nagash, will be that efforts to threaten Ethiopia into submission by sanctions, by withholding this and threatening that, has failed miserably in this case. And I think for policymakers at the State Department, that is a key lesson, that yes, Ethiopia has many soft points and many weaknesses, but the threat of sanctions and the threat of any type of threat does not lead to a policy change, including a threat of regime change, even though in the end, we may have seen the government succumb to threats of regime change, but all the same, Ethiopia has shown that the best diplomacy is not sort of a long stick and a short carrot, but a long carrot and a smaller stick. The US, I think, continues to play hard power, using hard power, and I like the term you've used, regime castration, which in effect is regime change by another name. It's everything but a change, and clearly the US government finds itself in a bind because it is in a position where it cannot change the Abiy regime because it's a popularly elected government, but they are also uncomfortable with his ways of doing things. So I think this phrase of regime castration is an apt one, where he is in power, but for all practical purposes has been decapitated, and the phrase, hence the phrase regime change. And unfortunately, yes, the government did accept Pretoria, largely to silence the guns, but equally to survive, and both politically and economically. So, but this acceptance of Pretoria and the pressure the Americans have put and so on does not mean we have a strong relationship. It is still there is power asymmetry between the US and Ethiopia in this matter, and it is a matter of buying time, because immediately after that, Ethiopia was quick to have a visit by the Chinese foreign minister and what. So the fact that the US prevailed in getting Ethiopia to accept should not be seen as a full rapprochement and relations that have been restructured. Through the US foreign policy, the US-Ethiopia policy is a function of the US Africa policy. State Department has recently come out with a new policy for Africa. We will have to wait and see how that plays out in Ethiopia. The racial double standard, I think, is there for all of us to deal with, and the sooner we deal with that and move on, I think the better will be. So let me stop with these brief comments and thank everyone for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gabriel. I really appreciate it. And the New Day in Peacemaking resonated with me, so I appreciate that so much. That was actually, in my opinion, for this recent holiday that was celebrated in Ethiopia, there was people united, celebrating together, no questions asked, where are you from, whatever, political aside. I think the people of Ethiopia are more united, except the political pressure, but Ethiopia will prevail. Having said that, several questions have been posted in the Q&A. Some of them were directed specifically to an individual speaker. Others are more not named. So I will read some of the questions and direct those to a specific individual when name is mentioned. And if you would answer those, I would appreciate it. The first question in the Q&A is, I believe it's directed to Ambassador Naji. It says, why are there high points in the Ethio-US relations during the time period you mentioned?
Wow. That's kind of an open-ended question.
You can give one example. I know there are several regimes, but an example of why the high points.
Well, let's do the most recent one. When Prime Minister Abiy came to power, it was so different from the last several decades that the whole world, it wasn't just the US, but the whole world kind of breathed a sigh of relief and says, wow, peace with Eritrea, letting people out of jail, talking about moving Ethiopia forward. So there are logical reasons for all of these things, and as there are for the low points. For example, the low points, one of the ones I mentioned, when the emperor was put out and the United States basically abandoned Ethiopia, was because of the way the United States saw the world at the time. So there are quote unquote logical reasons for these things, but we may call them logical, but in the greater scheme of things, they turn out to be very illogical. And I'll stop there.
Okay. The next question was, part of it is addressed in terms of the U.S. and Ethiopia relations and its impact with TPLF. But the question was, does the U.S. know what brought the rebellion against the TPLF? That was not directed to anybody, so anybody who's willing to answer.
Absolutely. I mean, there is no question that the U.S. knows every little thing that happens in that country. So, Ambassador, you can contradict me if I'm out of step, but there is no question that the U.S. knew. They saw this coming. I'm sure they've tried to advise even the Ethio-American government to make some changes. So they knew, and whether they were caught flat-footed or not, that's another question, but they definitely knew. They saw the writing on the wall, yes.
Okay.
And Ambassador is nodding his head, so I take that as a yes.
The next question goes to Ambassador Naji. How much of social media campaign by TPLF supporters influence U.S. decisions?
I'll be honest with you. When I was Assistant Secretary, we did not pay any attention. That's all I can talk about when I was there, that we did not pay any attention to social media, because it is, especially on this issue, it is so split. It is so vituperative. I could look out my window from the Assistant Secretary office, and every day there was a different Ethiopian group there demonstrating. I know the regional flags and the ethnic flags. So I could look out the window and say, there's the Tigrayans, there's the Oromo, so no, I would say that there are things like coincidences, but the social media campaign it influences Congress more than it does the State Department.
Okay, I guess this person was commenting that why is a tweet or TPLF immediately followed by a tweet from U.S. agency or in the NGO was, I think, part of the trigger.
Yeah. No, I can't say that happens. So no.
Okay. The next one is, what do you recommend the future U.S. policy on cultural relation of both countries in boosting people-to-people relation and stabilizing the social structure of Ethiopian community through building shared cultural values of Ethiopia? This is Ambassador Tibor. It's directed to you also.
All right. I am a huge believer in educational exchanges. That's why after I left the State Department in 2003, I took, I think, about 6 or 7 different groups of U.S. universities to Ethiopia to cement, exchanges between them, because Ethiopia, as was mentioned by a number of the speakers, is a young nation. And I believe that the U.S. higher education system is ideally suited to cooperate with Ethiopian higher education, which has grown tremendously, for Ethiopia to be able to use their higher education system as an instrument of national development. And U.S. universities could gain as much from Ethiopian universities as vice versa. So, I would really encourage U.S. administrations to support that with a lot of funding.
The next question says to Professor Vista, considering the historic relations between Ethio and U.S. in trade and other aspects, what would be the perspective of Ethiopia's return to AGOA? You are muted. We could not hear you.
What was and did you say Angola at the end of your statement?
AGOA, AGOA, AGOA. So
I don't.
You want me to read it again? It says, considering the historic relations between Ethio and U.S. in trade and other aspects, what would be the prospect of Ethiopia's return to AGOA?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
Do any of the other panelists know what the question means?
Anybody?
Well, I can take a crack at this. Right now, very shortly we'll know what the USTA, the trade agency's recommendation to the White House will be. It is not so much based on 100 years of relationship. It is going to be, there's a set of criteria that AGOA has, and Ethiopia, I think, by and large, meets all of those. I mean, I know countries that fell short of it, that have been retained in AGOA. So barring any extra political consideration, Ethiopia should be admitted back. In fact, January this month will be the period, and there is reason to believe that they will admit Ethiopia back. It is a mutually beneficial relationship. Let it not be said that Ethiopia this is a one-way relationship. The U.S. companies do benefit from AGOA, as does Ethiopia. So let's hope sanity prevails and they admit Ethiopia back.
Okay. The next question is for Mr. Nagash. Said the question is, Herman Cohen recently tweeted, the only way there will be true peace in Ethiopia is when the TPLF totally disappears as a political entity. Does anyone care to comment on this comment? Well, you or anyone else comment on Mr. Herman's assessment.
Okay, I'll take a stab at it. First, I just want to pay a little tribute to Professor Vestal. He's been a longtime friend of Ethiopia, and I've read some of his writings, especially on the TPLF. He had such an in-depth understanding of it. And I will say your years in Ethiopia were the golden years of Ethio-US relations. And after that, it's been kind of downhill. Now, regarding Mr. Cohen, I have kind of a conflicted view of this. He is someone who's trying to stay relevant in the waning years of his life. I think he did Ethiopia a disfavor at the London negotiations. And so he has a consultancy and he's trying to remain relevant. I mean, I know this may sound harsh, but I really don't give too much credence to this. There are a lot of people who are the expertise, but Africa is such a place that anybody, who's been out of power for so long can comment and have influence. They would not be listened to in any other part of the world. So I would just say it's a lot of noise. I wouldn't pay too much attention to him. If people think he's still in the US government or something, he's not, you know.
Okay. The next question says, where is the U.S., excuse me, where is the U.S. support to redeem those dying in Walaga, dying in hunger, imprisoned without justice, etc.? As to me, U.S. policy seems much more. The question answer right there, actually. Why is U.S. not helping those who are dying and others that mentioned? Anybody who wants to take that?
If I could go back for just a minute, this is Professor Vesta speaking. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I testified before the House Committee on Africa in 1994. I was just back from having spent some time in Ethiopia and was trying to sound warnings about the deficits of democracy and human rights abuses by the TPLF government. And Herman Cohen was representing the State Department. And instead of coming forward with ideas about how to improve the situation, he spent his time trying to denigrate me. And I thought that was bad form on his behalf. So I hope he is turning over a new leaf and indicating more empathy for what's going on in Ethiopia now. Thank you for letting me insert that.
Okay. Next question is, what are the real reasons for the U.S. to stand with TPLF against the Eritrea and Ethiopia?
Ethnicity.
Anyone else who wants to comment on that?
At the risk of speaking too much, let me, I could take a stab. I think the TPLF regime, in the end, you know, especially Zenawi, proved to be a very loyal surrogate for the US, even though he was tough and tough speaking and tough acting in the country. On the outside, he did their bidding for them. This was a guy who they could manage, I dare say control, but definitely manage. He understood how they operated, and they had a very symbiotic relationship where he got away with murder, virtually, I mean, literally with murder, and the US looked the other way because he did their bidding, particularly in Sudan in the fight against piracy and terrorism and Al-Shabaab and all that stuff, and South Sudan. So the TPLF was a group that, you know, it's the kind of group you work with, you hold your nose and continue to work with. And the US found that an attractive partner to work with on the ground. And of course, when things started to unravel, it became apparent that the TPLF never had any roots in the country, and it was just a US-supported regime. So that's just perhaps one angle of many angles. Thank you.
Okay.
Amen.
Okay, Ambassador Naji, there is a twofold question for you.
Hey, I'm 74 years old. Let's do one part at a time.
Okay. What do you think are the drawbacks of Ethiopia from staying in peace, from signing the peace treaty in South Africa?
I don't think there are any drawbacks because, you know, we can look at a lot of the reasons, but, you know, we went through 2 cycles of a terrible war. My point of view, both cycles were absolutely needless and useless, and a loss of a single life is, for me in Ethiopia, anywhere is a tragedy. I think the Ethiopian government had their reasons. They, at the point when they signed, the Ethiopian Federal Forces controlled about 70% of Tigray. But that other 30%, we know what the terrain is like. And of course, the Tigrayan regime had, come to the end of their, all of their energy. So there was reason on both sides. I mean, there's one point made, I think it was Otto Gabriel who made it, which I think is very important to state over and over again, is that no foreign power can force Ethiopia to do anything it does not want to do, no matter the immense amount of pressure. And I think that that is critically important for international countries to recognize in their dealings with Ethiopia. And so, in this case, I think the sides were ready to, to move forward.
Okay. The follow-up is, do you think Prime Minister Abiy has strong commitment for the current peace agreement with TPLF? And do TPLF leaders are trustworthy for further Ethiopian peace process?
Well, you're asking me to look inside the human heart and guess on the motivation, which I think only God can do. All I know is that up to now, the steps have been very encouraging. I don't think anybody really expected every deadline to be met, but every week there's yet one more step forward. I think this whole thing's going to be very Lenin-esque in that, Lenin said you go 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. I think that's going to happen, but I think everybody recognizes that it needs to succeed because Ethiopia needs to move forward with its prosperity and its very quick march to middle income status.
Okay. It was requested again to please the panelists respond to where is the U.S. support to redeem those dying in Wallaka, dying in hunger, imprisoned without justice, etc. And they wanted the panelists to comment on that, please. Anybody who wants to comment on that? Or
I can comment on that a little bit. I think we should, as people of Ethiopian origin, we should move away from looking to outside powers to bring solution to our problems. We need to look inward, create our own internal unity, and running after foreign powers to fix our problem is not a good idea. In fact, what we should ask them is not to really meddle, not to ask them to choose who should be the winner and loser. And that never works out too well. Whenever you ask outsiders to come in and decide who the winners and losers are. And I think one of the problems with the current arrangement is the US, I personally believe, weighed in so heavily in determining who should be the winners and losers. And that, at the end, never really works out too well.
okay. The next question is not directed to anybody, but if any of you would like to respond, what is really American interest in Ethiopia? Because by any means, Abiy's government is definitely better than the last regime. So why do America act like this during the war and now?
I think the charm offensive of the Woyeni was very effective. And that's why the government, at least part of it, reacts the way it does.
Anybody else?
I think a lot of the panelists have pointed out a long list of strategic interests that are beneficial both to the United States and Ethiopia. And, despite the obvious interests, we go through these ups and downs because of misinterpretations on one side or the other. I absolutely, totally agree with Mr. Nagash on, internal resolutions for these problems, because especially a complicated state society like Ethiopia, which to me is one of the most complicated anywhere, and the amount of understanding on the US side, I would say, is minuscule, even on those of us who have spent time in Ethiopia. So, there's just not a full understanding beyond, these the lists that we talked about, and they are there. They're very fundamental. So that's one of the reasons I have great hopes for the future, because it could be a very mutually reinforcing relationship.
Yeah, Ms. Mahalet, if I may come in, perhaps not on this, but on your earlier question, which my friend Negash has responded to, why should the US care in Walaga? That's a very profound question of values. If we say the relationship between the US and Ethiopia is based on shared values and principles, then while I fully subscribe to the statement that we shouldn't look to others to solve our problem, but from this side of the equation, from where I sit, where there is a violation of human life, where the sanctity of life is violated, whether it's in Walaga or in Myanmar or Burkina Faso, it doesn't matter. The US should speak up. The comparative advantage, the driving principle of the US is its democratic values for human life. And when human life is being violated anywhere and everywhere, the US should speak out. Don't speak out in Tigray and keep silent in Walaga. Don't speak out in Walaga and keep silent in Kenya or in Somalia. This should be a value that's upheld under all circumstances, in all countries, at all times. So that's why I think the US should say something. I don't know enough about what's happening in Walaga, to be honest. But regardless of who is causing the conflict, and all I know is civilians are dying. Unarmed people are dying, and our government and us as citizens should all speak out against that. Thank you.
Okay. One of the questions is, how does the ethnicized political environment in Ethiopia contribute to the challenges in formulating policy on the part of the US? And does the US feel that the environment poses a threat to long-term stability in the region? It's open to anyone who's willing to answer.
Can you repeat the question?
How does the ethnicized political environment in Ethiopia contribute to the challenges in formulating policy on the part of the US? And does the US feel that this environment poses a threat to long-term stability in the region?
Can I speak about our administration? I can't speak about the current one, but our administration felt very strongly that the state format for Ethiopia should be decided by Ethiopia, because the whole question of ethnic federalism was such a landmine, involved, that it was not up to the United States to tell Ethiopia whether it should be an ethnic federalism or a unitary state or a confederation or whatever. So the question presupposes that the United States has an interest in what state form Ethiopia takes. And at least I can speak my administration, there was, no such overriding interest.
Okay. Some of the questions are wrong, and I'm trying to catch up and reading them and asking them accordingly. Let's see. The US used its critical mass and influence to focus Prime Minister Abiy to negotiate with the TPLF? No? That's how they wrote. The US used its critical mass and influence to focus Prime Minister Abiy to negotiate with the TPLF? No? I guess it's a confirmation or do you agree question. I guess with the silence, you,
Ask the current U.S. administration.
okay. Mr. Nagash and Mr. Gabriel, what did TPLF or will get from the peace agreement?
I will say it survives to fight another day. Really very important. And this is, I feel like the TPLF has been rescued. And that could be dangerous. That has long-term implications for Ethiopia because it's a quarrelsome group, has almost fought with every group in its neighborhood, meaning with Eritreans, with Amharas, with Afars. It's a troublemaking group. And rescuing this group is why it's puzzling, coming to its rescue. Or people say it's a spent power. I wouldn't be so quick. You know, this group has come back many times. You know, it's the Rodney Dangerfield of Ethiopian politics, and they, you know, when you think it's gone, it does come back. So I think there are inherent dangers there, and part of the reason it's very difficult to go into detail is there is not a lot of information available. There is not a lot of transparency beyond PR. But I think there were some side agreements which are not released that were coming out in bits and pieces. So anyway, that's my perspective.
Okay. What is the balance between the responsibilities to protect convention and national sovereignty of countries? What's driving the Biden's government's policy? I see Ambassador Naji laughing and saying, ask the current administration. Because that was the response you provided earlier. Anybody else who wished to comment?
Let me take a stab at this. The responsibility to protect is a legal norm, a legal standard of the United Nations. It basically says that the sovereignty of people over government is higher than the sovereignty of government. Therefore, when there is a violation on the lives of people, then the responsibility to protect takes precedence over the sovereignty of nations. What is, and it is a highly laudable legal precedent, but what is problematic here is that this seems to be called into practice only in Africa. And perhaps a little bit in Myanmar, but largely it's been in Africa, where what it means is the lives of people is more important, therefore a UN force should go in, despite the sovereignty of Ethiopia, should go into Ethiopia and protect the people of either Amhara or Tigray or Walega or what have you. It's a very slippery slope. Once you start going down on it, there is no end, and unless you've planned your exit, jumping in may prove to be much easier than finding your way out. But the sovereignty to protect should not be evoked in this case, because there was enough protection by the government of Ethiopia for the people of Tigray, Amhara, and Afar. So there really was no legal basis for calling, evoking that principle. Thank you.
Okay. So unless the other panelists, other team members have seen questions I may have missed that has not been addressed, I believe the questions have been addressed that has been submitted. Did I miss anything that should be addressed for our team?
Yeah, there is one on the chat window.
Okay. The last one?
Yes, please.
Okay. Prime Prime Minister Abiy was very clear that there would be no negotiation within the TPLF until Mike Hammer stepped into the scene. Are our panelists really posturing here as if the US has no real influence? That's the question.
I can't speak for Mike. I've known him a long time, but the situation, situations in wars change. That's just the way it is. As I think it was Otto Nagash who said that, wars are extremely messy, horrible. Prime Minister Abiy, like any other statesman, came to that decision based on the way he saw the situation. Like I said, I'm sure that he had consultations with the military, with key people in the government, with key people in society, and he decided that it was in the interest of Ethiopia to move forward in a different direction.
There is one more question. Let me read out if it's not visible to you. So the question says, how does the US view the ethnic-based federalism that does not recognize individual rights or citizens? Is this ethnic-based federalism aligned with the strategic interests of the US in the Horn of Africa? I think this will be the last question. Thank you.
Thank you for helping me out. Dr. Muro, are you trying to speak? You're on mute if you are. Okay. Anybody who wants to respond?
Well, I'll say U.S. policy. I didn't work in policy, but I can, on the receiving end of it, as somebody was watching, it's very transactional. Whatever works at that time serves U.S. interest. If ethnic federalism will help you fight terrorism, you go along with that. If it's short term usually. It's a short-term convenience. The one thing consistent about U.S. policy, as someone who's been on the receiving end of it, is short-term convenience. Who's in power? Who's in the administration? Who's advancing this? So in Ethiopia, it did serve U.S. interest to a point when Meles was in power. Divide and rule. They knew what was going on, but as long as he kept the peace, it worked. So I don't think we should look for like a cardinal principle that is a guiding one. It's a policy of convenience, and with poor countries, there's a lot of opportunism because nobody makes a big deal, and nobody has ever been prosecuted for foreign policy malpractice. And there are a lot of cases in which people should have been held accountable, and secrecy allows the diplomats to get away literally with murder because there is no accountability. And with poor countries, people with kind of mediocre power in Africa, they have disproportionate roles. So we should not, first of all, like Horn of Africa is 8 countries lumped together. The US looks at this like this messy box, not even treated Ethiopia individually so much most of the time. So we should have modest expectations that are kind of a internal built-in racial biases built into U.S. foreign policy, how it looks at Africa, Ethiopia as bigger people, bigger nation, people would send refugees. So we should have a kind of a realistic expectation. This is not, anyway, that's it.
Well, thank you very much for each of the panelists who participated. I now invite Dr. Erko to give the closing remark. Thank you. You're on mute, Dr. Erko.
Thank you, Mahali. This brings us to the end of our conversation. I would like to thank the panel for bringing up important issues and problems that confront the two nations. Many have been mentioned, and the one that attracted my attention was lack of united policy on the part of the US government. Another one is low priority given to Africa, Ethiopia in particular. There are many issues that have been raised and highlighted very well. The solution to all this lack of unified policy needs to be further discussed, and some ways of making it work in a very unified way is very important. All over the panel did really an excellent job, and thank you so much for that. I also would like to thank our technical team for running the conversation, managing the conversation very, very well. And also the audience, for asking those questions that you want some answer. And finally, to our moderator, who did an excellent job of moderating the conference. Before I conclude, the conference, I would like to do some commercial on the part of Ethio-American. Ethio-American has been doing such conferences for a long time by organizing symposiums and conferences that are very important on current issues as well as strategic issues. We plan to continue to do that in the future. Immediately, we are planning to have a very important conference as well concerning Ethiopic script, which has become a political issue in Ethiopia. Maybe there are only 18 scripts in the world. One of them is Ethiopic script. There could be more than 200 countries, and they use one of these 18 scripts. In Ethiopia, there is a problem concerning the use of scripts. Many ethnic groups use Latin script. And we plan to do a series of conferences on the historical development of Ethiopic script, as well as the historical development of Amharic, and show how the script has the capacity to be used by any language in the world. I think many linguists, philologists have certified that the Ethiopic script is one of the best available in the world. And we are planning to do that in the near future, in 2 weeks' time, 3 weeks' time. Please stay tuned. We'll announce the program shortly. Thank you very much. This concludes the conference for today. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all.